The instructors barely noticed him when he walked in. He stood near the back of the shooting range classroom, hands clasped loosely in front of him, posture relaxed to the point of looking uninterested. His clothes were plain, his expression unreadable, no expensive gear, no confident swagger, no stories volunteered about past experience. Just a simple man among people eager to be seen. The others, however, made sure to be noticed. They compared firearms, discussed calibers, bragged about competitions and certifications. Laughter broke out near the front when someone asked who here was just trying it for fun. A few heads turned instinctively toward him. No one asked his name. The instructor began the lesson with enthusiasm, explaining stance, grip, breathing. When volunteers were requested to demonstrate, hands shot up. Skilled shooters stepped forward one by one, firing tight groupings that earned nods of approval and murmurs of respect. The man at the back watched quietly. Not impressed. Not intimidated. Just observing. When it was his turn to step forward, there was hesitation, then a few smirks. Someone whispered, "He'll need luck." Another chuckled, already bored. The instructor offered a polite smile, the kind reserved for beginners who would soon be corrected. "Take your time," the instructor said kindly. "Focus on the basics." The man nodded once. He didn't rush. He didn't fumble. He adjusted his stance with small, precise movements that went mostly unnoticed. His grip was firm but relaxed. His breathing slow, controlled. Those who knew what to look for might have paused, but no one was really looking. The best shooter in the class stepped aside, arms crossed, confident. His last shot still echoed in memory, a near-perfect grouping that had set the standard for the day. The man raised the firearm. The range grew quieter, though no one could say why. Maybe it was the way he stood, too calm. Maybe it was the stillness in his eyes, focused not on the target itself, but on something beyond it. He exhaled. The trigger moved smoothly beneath his finger. And just before the shot rang out, before the sound could break the silence, the instructor felt an unexpected tightening in his chest, a sudden thought he couldn't explain. This man has done this before. The shot was about to tell the truth. The report cracked through the range, sharp, clean, unmistakable. The target barely moved, swaying for a fraction of a second before settling back into stillness. For a heartbeat, no one reacted. The sound faded, echoing off the concrete walls, and the room held its breath as if waiting for permission to respond. The instructor leaned forward. So did the class. The man lowered the firearm calmly, engaging the safety with a practiced flick of his thumb. He didn't look around. He didn't search for reactions. His eyes remained fixed on the target downrange. A second passed. Then the instructor's expression changed. "What?" he murmured, stepping closer to the monitor. The digital readout updated slowly, almost teasingly. The impact point appeared on the screen, and the room shifted. Dead center. Not just within the grouping. Not brushing the edge of perfection. The exact center. A ripple of disbelief spread through the class. Chairs scraped as people stood. The best shooter uncrossed his arms without realizing it, his confident smirk fading into something tighter, more uncertain. "That's lucky," someone said weakly. The instructor didn't answer. He studied the stance in his memory, the grip, the breathing. None of it had looked accidental. None of it matched the tension beginners carried into their first shots. Again, the instructor said, more firmly now. "Take another shot." The man hesitated, not because he was unsure, but because he seemed to be considering something. Then he nodded once and stepped back into position. This time, the room was silent. No whispers. No laughter. Every eye followed him as he raised the firearm again. The target seemed farther away now, as if the distance had stretched under the weight of expectation. He adjusted his footing slightly, shifting his weight by a fraction. The instructor felt it again, that tightening in his chest. The man exhaled. The trigger moved. And just before the second shot broke, before the truth could repeat itself, the best shooter in the class realized something unsettling. If this wasn't luck, then everything he thought he knew about skill was about to be rewritten. The second shot rang out, cleaner somehow, quieter in its authority. The target jerked once more, barely perceptible, then stilled. No one spoke. The echo faded faster this time, swallowed by a silence that felt heavier than before. The instructor didn't wait. He moved to the monitor, eyes locked on the screen as the system processed the hit. A small circle appeared, then another mark layered over it so precisely it looked as though the first shot had never been there. A perfect overlap. A single hole. Someone let out a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. The best shooter took a step forward, disbelief etched across his face. "That's not possible," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "That distance, that grouping." The man at the firing line lowered the firearm again, movements economical, unhurried. He cleared it, placed it down, and stepped back as if his role in the moment were already finished. The instructor stared at the screen, then at the man. "How long?" he asked. The man tilted his head slightly. "How long what?" "How long have you been shooting?" the instructor clarified. The man considered the question, eyes briefly unfocusing as if measuring years against memory. "A while," he said at last. A few nervous laughs fluttered through the room and died quickly. The instructor nodded slowly, then turned to the class. "All right," he said, voice steadier than he felt. "Let's take a short pause." But no one moved. The man picked up his bag, as if preparing to step aside, when the instructor held up a hand. "Stay," he said. "Please." The word landed differently this time. The instructor turned back to the best shooter. "Why don't you take another shot?" he said. "Same distance. Same conditions." The best shooter hesitated, then squared his shoulders and stepped forward. This was familiar territory. This was where he belonged. He fired. The shot was excellent, tight, controlled, but when it appeared on the monitor, the difference was undeniable. Close to center. Not perfect. The comparison hung in the air. The instructor didn't comment. He simply looked back at the man who had been ignored minutes earlier. "Your turn again," he said. The man returned to the line, expression unchanged. No pride. No challenge. Just quiet readiness. As he raised the firearm once more, the instructor noticed something he hadn't before, a faint mark along the man's wrist, pale against his skin. Not a scar from sport or accident. A scar from training. From somewhere that didn't hand out trophies. The instructor's throat tightened. And as the man steadied his aim for the next shot, the class began to understand that this wasn't a fluke, and this wasn't a lesson. It was a revelation they were about to witness, whether they were ready or not. The range felt different now. The hum of the ventilation system sounded louder, sharper, as if the room itself were aware that something had shifted. The man's breathing was the only rhythm that mattered, slow, even, unhurried. His shoulders settled, his grip adjusted by a fraction so small it would have gone unnoticed before. But now, everyone was watching. The instructor leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing, not in doubt, but in recognition. The stance. The balance. The way the man's weight aligned with the line of fire. None of it was accidental. This wasn't classroom technique. This was survival. The man's finger rested against the trigger, pressure building gradually, smoothly. No jerks. No anticipation. Just control. The kind that comes from repetition under consequences far heavier than a missed score. A bead of sweat traced down the best shooter's temple as he watched. The man exhaled. The shot cracked through the range. This time, no one rushed the monitor. No one whispered. They already knew what they were going to see. The display updated. Another perfect center. Not overlapping this time. Dead center, again. A collective murmur rippled through the class, restrained but unmistakable. The instructor straightened slowly, his face now fully serious. That distance, he said quietly, is where most people start to lose consistency. The man lowered the firearm and cleared it, his movements precise, habitual. He turned slightly, as if to step away again, but the instructor spoke before he could. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" The man paused. For the first time, something flickered across his expression, not pride, not fear, but a guarded stillness. He glanced briefly at the scar on his wrist, then back to the instructor. "Somewhere quiet," he said. The instructor didn't push. He nodded once, as one professional to another. The best shooter let out a breath and laughed softly, shaking his head. "One shot," he said. "You beat me with one shot." The man didn't respond. The instructor turned to the class. "This," he said, gesturing toward the target, "is why we don't judge skill by noise." He looked back at the man. "If you're willing," he added, "I'd like you to stay for the advanced session." The man hesitated again, longer this time. His gaze drifted past the range, past the targets, to something only he could see. Whatever memories lived there weren't simple ones. Finally, he nodded. "All right." The word landed softly, but it carried weight. Because everyone in the room understood now, this class had stopped being about learning how to shoot. And had become about learning who had been standing among them all along. The advanced session didn't begin right away. No one seemed eager to move, as if breaking the moment might scatter whatever understanding had just settled over the room. The instructor finally cleared his throat and gestured toward the benches. "Unload and secure," he said, voice measured. "We'll reset." The man complied without comment. He moved efficiently, checking and rechecking, the way someone does when mistakes are not forgiven. When he stepped back, he didn't take the front row or the center spot. He returned to the edge, quiet as before. But the room no longer treated him as invisible. Whispers followed him now, not mocking, not dismissive, but careful. Curious. Respectful. A few students stole glances at his hands, his posture, the scar that now seemed impossible to ignore. The best shooter approached him hesitantly. "Hey," he said, offering a hand. That was impressive. The man looked at the hand for a brief moment, then shook it. His grip was firm, brief, unshowy. "Good shooting," the best shooter added, sincerity edging out pride. The man nodded once. "You too." It wasn't false humility. It was simply true. When the advanced session began, the instructor changed the drills. Longer distances. Smaller targets. Time constraints. Stress added deliberately, timers, commands, movement. The kind of exercises that separated those who practiced from those who knew. The man watched every explanation closely, not because he needed instruction, but because he respected process. When it was time for movement drills, most of the class struggled. Shots widened. Breathing quickened. Confidence cracked under pressure. Then it was his turn. He didn't rush when the buzzer sounded. He moved smoothly, efficiently, every step placed with intention. His shots came measured and precise, each one landing where it needed to, no wasted motion, no wasted rounds. The instructor's jaw tightened. This wasn't just accuracy. This was decision-making under stress. Between drills, the instructor found himself standing beside the man. "You ever teach?" he asked quietly. The man didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands with a cloth, gaze distant. "Not officially." "But you've led people," the instructor pressed, already knowing the answer. The man's eyes flicked up, sharp, assessing, then softened again. "A long time ago." The instructor nodded, choosing not to ask more. Across the range, the class watched differently now. They weren't measuring themselves against the targets anymore. They were watching him, how he breathed, how he reset after each drill, how nothing about him wasted energy. As the session continued, the realization settled deeper. This man hadn't come here to prove anything. He had come here to disappear. And somehow, with a single shot, the class had pulled him back into the light, whether he wanted to be there or not. The drills pushed on. Targets reset farther back now, silhouettes reduced, margins thinner. The instructor layered in noise, recorded gunfire, shouted commands, a countdown ticking louder than necessary. Stress, manufactured but effective. Most shooters faltered. Hands tightened. Breaths shortened. Shots drifted. The man didn't change. He moved when told, stopped when told, fired only when it mattered. His rhythm stayed steady, immune to the pressure designed to fracture it. When others rushed to beat the clock, he let the clock chase him, and still won. The instructor watched closely, arms crossed, no longer pretending this was a class. This was observation. At one point, a student fumbled a reload, panic flashing across his face. The man noticed immediately. He didn't step in, didn't shout advice, but he shifted his position just enough to block the student from the line of fire, subtly, instinctively, without drawing attention. The student never realized what had happened. The instructor did. During the next pause, the instructor lowered his voice. "You've been in situations where mistakes cost lives," he said, not a question. The man didn't deny it. He simply checked the chamber again, slower this time. "People make more mistakes when they're being watched," he replied. The instructor nodded. "You don't." The man finally met his eyes. There was no challenge there, only a quiet warning. "I learned not to." Across the room, the best shooter watched him differently now. No comparison. No competition. Just respect edged with something closer to humility. The instructor clapped his hands once. "Final drill," he announced. "One shot. Cold barrel. Longest distance we have." A ripple went through the room. Cold shots were unforgiving. No warm-up. No adjustment. Pure fundamentals, or failure. One by one, shooters stepped up. Good shots. Solid shots. A few misses. The instructor marked the results without comment. Finally, he turned to the man. "You don't have to," he said quietly. The man considered this. Then he stepped forward anyway. He took his time setting up. Checked stance. Checked sight picture. Let the range noise fade into nothing. The class watched in absolute silence now, aware that they were witnessing something they might never see again. The man exhaled slowly. The target seemed impossibly far. His finger settled on the trigger. And just before he took the shot, before sound and certainty collided, the man's eyes flicked briefly toward the exit. As if part of him was already deciding what would happen after this. The buzzer sounded. And the moment balanced on the edge of everything he had tried to leave behind. The buzzer's echo faded, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt deliberate. The man didn't rush. Cold shot. No margin. No excuses. He let the noise drain from his body, every muscle settling into stillness. His breathing slowed until even that seemed unnecessary. The range, the people, the pressure, all of it narrowed until there was only the front sight and the distant target. He adjusted his grip by a fraction. The instructor felt it again, that tightening in his chest. Not anticipation. Recognition. The man's finger took up the slack in the trigger, smooth and controlled, pressure building without urgency. This wasn't a shot taken to impress. It was a shot taken because it needed to be taken. The best shooter unconsciously held his breath. The report cracked through the range. Sharp. Final. The target swayed, then stilled. No one moved. The man lowered the firearm and cleared it, already turning slightly away as if the result no longer belonged to him. He didn't look at the monitor. He didn't need to. The instructor stared at the screen as the system processed. The dot appeared. Then settled. A perfect hit, dead center mass. Not just accurate. Decisive. A low murmur rolled through the room, disbelief laced with awe. Someone laughed softly, not in mockery, but in surrender. The instructor exhaled slowly. Cold shot, he said. Longest distance. No warm-up. He turned to the man. That's not something you learn at a range. The man paused near the bench, his back half turned. For a moment, it seemed like he might walk away without answering. Instead, he spoke quietly. I learned it when missing wasn't an option. The words settled heavily. The instructor didn't press. He didn't need to. Whatever past the man carried was not a story meant for this room. But the class had changed. The jokes were gone. The comparisons meaningless. What remained was a shared understanding that mastery often walks in unnoticed, and the loudest confidence rarely belongs to the most capable. As the session wrapped up, the instructor approached him one last time. If you ever want to train here, he said, you don't pay. The man looked at him, surprised, just slightly. Why? He asked. The instructor smiled faintly. Because people like you remind us why we started. The man nodded, slung his bag over his shoulder, and turned toward the exit. But before he reached the door, he felt it, the weight of eyes on his back, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Where does someone like you go after a shot like that? And as his hand touched the door handle, the answer remained just out of reach, waiting, unresolved, ready to follow him beyond the range. The door didn't open right away. The man's hand rested on the handle longer than necessary, as if he were weighing something invisible. The range behind him had fallen quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, charged, watchful, aware. He felt it without turning around. Curiosity. Respect. Questions no one dared to ask. The instructor cleared his throat softly. You don't owe anyone here an explanation, he said, almost as if reading the tension in the room. The man nodded once, still facing the door. I know. He finally pushed it open, letting in a thin strip of daylight and the distant sounds of the outside world, cars passing, voices somewhere far away. Ordinary life. The kind he'd been trying to blend back into. But before he could step through, a voice behind him spoke up. Younger. Hesitant. Sir? He paused. A student, one of the quieter ones, stood halfway out of his seat. How did you stay that calm, he asked. When everyone was watching? The man turned slowly now, meeting the student's eyes. For a moment, the room saw something else in his expression, not hardness, not pride, but understanding. You don't, he said. Not at first. He stepped back inside just enough for his words to carry. You learn to focus on what matters, he continued quietly. You stop performing. You stop trying to win. You do the job in front of you, one step at a time. The student nodded, absorbing every word. The man glanced around the room, at the instructor, the best shooter, the others who had laughed earlier and now wouldn't meet his gaze. There was no resentment in his eyes. Just distance. Ignoring people is easy, he added. Ignoring yourself is harder. Silence followed. The instructor felt the weight of that sentence settle deeper than any lesson he'd planned to teach that day. The man turned back to the door, stepped out into the light, and pulled it closed behind him. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then the instructor spoke, voice low but steady. All right, he said. Pack up. But even as the class began to disperse, the image of that single, perfect shot lingered, along with the sense that they hadn't just witnessed exceptional skill. They had crossed paths with someone who had lived a life most of them could only imagine, and who was still carrying it, quietly, into whatever waited next. Outside, the air felt cooler than it should have. The man stood just beyond the door, letting the sounds of the street wash over him. Engines idled. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. Normal, unthreatening noise, yet his body catalogued every sound automatically, assigning distance, direction, relevance. He exhaled, long and slow. That was when he noticed the black sedan. It was parked across the street, engine running, windows tinted just enough to be forgettable. He would have missed it once. Years ago. Not now. He didn't stare. Didn't react. He adjusted the strap of his bag and began walking in the opposite direction, pace unhurried. Reflections in shop windows told him what he needed to know. The sedan rolled forward, matching him, staying casual. A coincidence. Until it wasn't. He turned a corner, then another. The city folded around him, familiar and unfamiliar at once. The sedan didn't follow the second turn. Instead, a man stepped out of a cafe doorway ahead of him. Mid-30s. Athletic. Earpiece hidden poorly beneath his collar. The man stopped walking. So did the stranger. They looked at each other for a half-second too long. Recognition flickered, not personal, but professional. The stranger smiled. "You move like you didn't forget," he said quietly. The man's jaw tightened. "I wasn't trying to be found. Yet here we are." The stranger glanced briefly over his shoulder, then back. "You made a lot of noise today." "At a shooting class," the man replied. "That's hardly a headline." The stranger chuckled. "You don't shoot like a civilian." Neither did the people who'd trained him. Neither did the ones he'd buried. The man shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself so the alley at his back stayed clear. "What do you want?" The stranger lowered his voice. Someone upstairs noticed a perfect cold shot at distance. That kind of muscle memory doesn't disappear. The man's eyes hardened. "I'm done." "So you say?" The stranger leaned closer, his tone changing. "But there's a situation. Complicated. Sensitive. And the people handling it aren't steady." The man said nothing. "You could walk away," the stranger continued. "No one would stop you. But if you do, what happens next won't be clean." A car door closed softly behind them. The man didn't turn. He already knew, whatever life he'd been trying to return to was slipping out of reach again. And the decision he thought he'd already made was about to be tested in ways the shooting range never could. The man stood there, the city humming around him, the weight of an old life pressing in from every direction. He looked at the stranger once more, really looked at him now. The eager tension behind the calm. The hope disguised as professionalism. He had seen that expression before, worn it once himself. "No," the man said. The word landed without force, without anger. Just finality. The stranger blinked. "You didn't even hear the details." "I don't need them," the man replied. "If I step back in, I don't get to choose how far it goes. I stop being a man again and start being a tool." The stranger hesitated. "People could get hurt." The man nodded slowly. "They always do." He reached into his bag, not suddenly, not threateningly, and pulled out the range pass he'd been given earlier. He handed it to the stranger. "That shot today," he said. "That was me proving something, to myself. That I can still be precise without being ruthless." The stranger frowned. "You think walking away makes you clean?" The man's gaze softened, just slightly. "No. I think it makes me human." A long pause stretched between them. Behind the stranger, the sedan's engine cut off. Finally, the stranger stepped back. "If things go bad," he said, "we won't come looking again." "I know," the man replied. He turned and walked away, not fast, not cautious, just steady. Each step carried him farther from the pull of old orders and closer to something quieter, harder to protect, but worth fighting for in a different way. Back at the range, the instructor would tell the story for years about the day a quiet man walked in, fired one unforgettable shot, and disappeared. And somewhere in the city, a man who once lived by the trigger learned how to live without it, carrying the weight of what he'd been, and the fragile hope of what he chose to become.